Ukraine says it does not want to permanently occupy Russia's Kursk region after launching a major offensive into the territory last week. Ukraine says its intention is to thwart Russian attacks on its territory and to pull Russian military resources away from the Ukrainian front line. Russia's defense ministry has released footage of what it says are operations against Ukrainian forces operating inside the Kursk region close to the Ukrainian border. Analysts say Ukrainian troops have advanced up to 25 kilometres into Russian territory. Russians displaced by the fighting are arriving in the capital, Moscow. More than 130,000 people have already been forced from their homes, with another 60,000 in the process of leaving on Tuesday. Well, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy says his forces now have seized 74 settlements in the Kursk region. He's made his fullest statement yet on the offensive.
We must make full use of our achievements, and we will. We are paying attention to every direction of our state's defence, to all frontline directions. The Donetsk region, Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Kramatorsk, Kharkiv, the south. Special attention is being paid to the Kursk region, and thus to the protection of all our border communities nearby. The more the Russian military presence in the border area is destroyed, the closer peace and real security will be for our country. The Russian state must be held accountable for what it has done, and it will be.
Meanwhile, a bipartisan delegation from the US Senate has been in Kyiv. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy met with Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal and the Republican Lindsey Graham, who are both pushing for more US support for Ukraine. Here's Senator Graham commenting on the Ukrainian incursion into Russia.
And you're in Russia. Bold and brilliant. Well done. I'm glad you didn't tell us about it. I'm glad you just did it. And taking this war to Putin and make him understand and pay a price is the right thing. So I'm hoping that in 2024, you'll get more military aid from the Congress. We're going to have a new president next year. I think there's a case to be made that is in our national security interest, whether you're Republican or Democrat, for Ukraine to survive and thrive.
Now, Mark Cancian is a retired US Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome to DW. Let's pick up on what we just heard from Lindsey Graham there. The US had no prior knowledge of the Kursk operation. So did Washington and Moscow miss the massing of Ukrainian troops?
I suspect that the United States had some knowledge and some inkling about what was going to happen. We watched these events closely, and we saw that the Russians would invade back in 2022. On the other hand, the Ukrainians were keeping this very close hold. They didn't tell their commanders until just a few days before, and they didn't tell the troops until the day before. So operational security was very tight.
For a Republican, Lindsey Graham has been a strong backer of Ukraine. Do you think he's an outlier? Because the rhetoric of the Trump campaign is that support for Ukraine is likely to stop under him.
Half the Republicans in Congress have continued to support Ukraine. There is a large number who have become very skeptical. They've probably led by J.D. Vance, Senator Vance from Ohio. And we've heard a lot of that from Trump. But support for Ukraine is still very strong among the Republicans and among the Democrats, except on the far left.
And why do you think Ukraine has launched this incursion into Russia?
Well, it's very plausible that the reasons that they gave are the actual reasons. That is, that they wanted to divert Russian forces from other parts of the front, make them defend this northern boundary. You have to keep in mind that while most of the fighting over the last 2 years has been in the east, this northern boundary has been very lightly defended by both sides. So this forces the Russians to not just defend this incursion, but along the whole border. The attack has also raised the morale of Ukrainian troops. They've been on the defensive, been taking heavy casualties for many months. Now they're on the attack. And it's possible that the Ukrainians will hold some bit of Russian territory as a bargaining chip for peace negotiations when those happen.
And does Ukraine's Western backers, obviously the United States the biggest amongst them, do they now seem to be much more casual about the idea of Ukraine using their weapons to launch attacks into Russia?
There's no question that the risk tolerance of the United States and Western backers is now much higher than it was a year ago, 2 years ago, at the beginning of the war. You may remember that back when the war first began, the United States was concerned about sending HIMARS to Ukraine because they could conduct deep strikes. Then we were worried about ATACMS and those deep strikes. But with each increase in military aid and capability, the Russians have not been able to respond. They've stopped rattling their nuclear saber. So the United States and the West have been willing to be more aggressive in both what they provide and then how those materials are used.
So what do you think Russian retaliation is likely to look like?
Well, I don't think the Russians are going to be able to retaliate in the sense of taking vengeance. They've stopped rattling their nuclear saber, as I mentioned, but they will react militarily. And we're seeing that now as they're moving military forces from other areas to this salient, this incursion, to try to contain it, maybe try to push it back. You have to keep in mind that although there are a fair number of forces in this area, really, it's made up of disconnected battle groups. So there's a lot of fluidity, and the Russians might be able to counterattack, push the Ukrainians back.
So Kyiv says this is not a permanent occupation. So how and when do you think they will leave Kursk?
Well, that's an interesting question because they might just hold on to it until the end of fighting and try to trade it for some of their own captured territory. And in that sense, they're saying, you know, we don't want to permanently hold this, but we're going to hold it for the rest of the conflict. On the other hand, it could signal that they will pull back at some point to the original border, having made their point about Russian weaknesses, about the ability of the Ukrainians to continue attacks. I think we'll see that in the next couple of days. But so far, the Ukrainians seem to be digging in, holding on, not making preparations to pull back.
Western analysts say Russia suffered something like 180,000 casualties in its offensive in the Donbass this year. Since January, Russia's estimated to have captured about the same amount of territory as Ukraine has in a week in Kursk. Is this what people mean when they talk about asymmetric war?
Well, this isn't really asymmetric in the sense that the attack by the Ukrainians is made with conventional forces. It is aimed at a weak point in the Russian defenses. This is a classic tactic in warfare. We've been seeing it, for millennia. But it is a classic maneuver, and it is very creative. One place where we have seen actual asymmetric warfare is in the naval war in the Baltic. That is that Ukraine has been able to push the Russian Navy back out of Crimea, back to the eastern side of the Black Sea, even though it has no ships and no naval aircraft. It's been able to do this with long-range missiles and drones. That's truly asymmetric.
Good talking to you. Thanks for joining us. Colonel Mark Cancian from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies.
Thanks for having me on the show.
I'm joined now by Stephen Blank. He's a senior fellow at the American think tank, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Welcome to DW. Now, Ukraine says it's not interested in keeping the territory it has taken in Russia. How risky is it for Kyiv to hold on to it right now?
Well, I think it would be very risky because it would justify Russian complaints about an invasion, although it's not really what's happening. And militarily, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for them to hold on to territory in Kursk. I think the Ukrainians have made their point. and whatever their objectives were, because they have not told us, they probably feel they have realized them, and caused a great deal of disarray in the Russian rear and in the Russian high command. So I think that they will be moving on from where they are and possibly either moving back towards Ukraine or attacking the Russian army from the rear.
The incursion caught Russia by surprise, but apparently it also caught Kyiv's allies in Europe and in Washington by surprise. How could Ukraine plan this attack without the West knowing?
Well, I think that's a tribute to Ukraine's intelligence and operational security preparation that nobody knew. And it indicates a high degree of quality among those sectors of the Ukrainian high command and the troops that were involved in this operation. Apparently, they were only told the day before that they were going into Russia. And I think you have to understand that this is not a criticism. This is actually a sign of success.
Now, this has clearly been embarrassing for Vladimir Putin. He's selling this at home as the West waging war on Russia. I'm curious, how dangerous is that rhetoric?
Well, it's the standard Russian rhetoric that we've been hearing for the last 2 years. So I don't think it's any more dangerous now than it has been before. What would be dangerous is if they actually believed that the West was attacking them and launched combat operations against the West. You have to understand that Russia is already attacking the West in multiple ways. For example, in Germany, we discovered a Russian attempt to kill the head of Rheinmetall. So we've seen that. We've seen sabotage. We've seen espionage. We've seen other criminal attacks on European targets.
How is this attack seen in Russia from what we know? Could this threaten Vladimir Putin's grip on power in any way?
Well, it's too early to tell, but it certainly does not reflect well on either Putin or his commanders. And it could, in the future, lead to other such events that would undermine his authority. But it's too early to make any kind of judgment along those lines.
Thank you for your analysis. That's Stephen Blank from the Foreign Policy Institute.
You're welcome.
Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service has accused Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskiy of taking, quote, insane steps that threaten an escalation of their conflict far beyond the region. Zelenskiy says his troops are now taking the war to Russia, where they say they control 1,000 square kilometers of territory in the Kursk region.
Thousands of Russians moving to safer places as Ukrainian troops seize control of dozens of their villages. Reporting to Russian President Vladimir Putin, the governor of Kursk said Ukraine had widened its area of control.
The situation in the Kursk region is difficult. 28 settlements are under enemy control. There is no clear front line, and the problem we have is understanding where the enemy combat units are.
Thousands of Ukrainian troops rammed through the Russian border last week into the Kursk region with tanks and armored vehicles. They have now advanced into neighboring Belgorod. Ukraine says it controls about 1,000 square kilometers. That's an area bigger than New York City, around Kursk alone. The surprise attack exposed the weakness of Russian border defenses in the area. President Volodymyr Zelenskiy, who only acknowledged the incursion over the weekend, says Ukraine will offer humanitarian assistance to evacuees on the Ukrainian side of the border. The Russian army is scrambling to contain the breach and has been forced to call in reserves. It has released images of what it says are strikes on Ukrainian tanks in Kursk. But Putin says Moscow's army will prevail.
It appears that the enemy, with the help of Western masters, is fulfilling their will, and the West is fighting us with the hands of the Ukrainians. The enemy will get a decent response, and all our goals will be achieved.
Meanwhile, Russian volunteers are distributing humanitarian aid to evacuees arriving at temporary accommodations, making them painfully aware of the impacts of a war that Putin has tried to shield them from.
And our correspondent, Sonia Phalniker, is in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Sonia, what more can you tell us about the developments in Kursk?
Well, there are reports of ongoing evacuations of Russian civilians in the Kursk region. We've heard from Ukraine's top military commander, Alexander Syrsky, who says that Ukraine now controls 1,000 square kilometers in the Kursk region. He says those offensive operations are still ongoing exactly a week after Ukrainian troops first pushed their way into Kursk. Now, there are several reports of thousands of Ukrainian tanks and troops, several military brigades being involved in this operation, and now they seem to be pushing deeper into that region, as your report talked about. But also across the border on the Ukrainian side, in the northern region of Sumy, the situation is tense. We're hearing that more than 20,000 civilians have been evacuated from there, from towns and settlements. The authorities say that overnight Russia carried out missile strikes on Sumy, hitting infrastructure, damaging power lines, a gas pipeline, a hospital building. There were several cars that were damaged in that attack as well. And today we're hearing that Ukraine's military command has now imposed new restrictions on civilian movements in a 20-kilometer border zone of Sumy, citing kind of intensifying hostilities in the region and saying, there are increased activities of what they say are Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the area.
Sonia, what do people in Ukraine make of this move? How do they feel about their country's troops now suddenly fighting inside Russia and seizing territory?
Well, I think there's little doubt that this huge push by Ukrainian troops into Russia has certainly provided a significant boost to Ukrainian morale. The Ukrainians I've spoken to here in the capital, Kyiv, most of them have been quite happy. Some of them really taken aback at this kind of sudden turn of events, this shift in the war narrative after months of, bad news and setbacks on the battlefield. But they're certainly cheering on this incursion. But of course, there are also concerns about retaliatory attacks by Russia, what exactly that could target. Though it has to be said, of course, that Ukrainian cities and towns, unfortunately, are already accustomed to large-scale Russian bombardment of civilian and energy as well as industrial infrastructure. So I think some people are asking, what could get worse? Like what would be the worst response now by Russia? So there are concerns. One other major concern I think here is that if Russia were to deploy a lot of troops in Kursk and actually cut off and surround Ukrainian troops, that could potentially lead to mass casualties, but even mass capture of prisoners of war, and that is a really fraught topic in Ukraine. So there are certainly concerns here as well.
Now, we've looked at the situation in Kursk, we've looked at the situation in Sumy. How likely is the Ukrainian incursion into Russia to affect other fronts in the war?
Well, one of the Ukrainian lawmakers here have said that one of the objectives of this incursion, though it is speculation at this stage, is to kind of divert Russian troops and move them and equipment onto Russian territory away from the east of Ukraine, specifically the eastern Donbas front, where Russia for months has been carrying out relentless attacks and really piling on the pressure on overstretched Ukrainian defenses around strategic towns like Pokrovsk and Toretsk in the Donetsk region. So the hope is that this will kind of ease some of the pressure in the east, but that has not happened. The Ukrainian military, in fact, has said that Russia has stepped up attacks on the Pokrovsk front and that fighting has, in fact, intensified since that incursion by Ukrainian troops into the Kursk region.
That was DW Sonia Phalniker from Kyiv. Thank you so much.